Thank you all for joining us again. My name is Ben Callahan, and I am the president of Sparkbox. And I thought it would be helpful to start with just a quick story. So at the end of last year, we started 2 consulting engagements with 2 pretty different organizations, both very tech-savvy companies, both large organizations, both have had design systems for years actually now. Both of these organizations had dedicated individuals working on their design systems. And in both cases, we were hired to come in and kind of do an assessment just to sort of evaluate the health, the maturity of their design systems, and as part of that, to offer some guidance on how they might proceed. So as part of those 2 separate consulting engagements, we performed a lot of interviews. We talked to tons of folks inside both of these companies. We talked to people who were of different disciplines, but that were on the design system team. We talked to people who were subscribers of those systems, or folks who they were building the system for, the product designers, product engineers, product owners who were using the design systems. And we spent a good amount of time talking to leadership inside both of those organizations. And completing those 2 engagements kind of in parallel left me with 2 big takeaways. The first of those was that there is still a lot of confusion out there about design systems. I'm fortunate. I get to talk to a lot of people. Like, part of my job is just kind of reaching out to folks who are doing this work and just chatting and understanding what they're working on, what they're struggling with. And it's pretty common, I would say, to hear that they feel, and we see this too, that just a lot of folks inside our companies have different ideas about what a system is, about how to do it, about why to do it. And I'll say, even in these 2 engagements with large organizations, big budgets, dedicated teams, even in those situations, right, folks have different ideas about this. So there's just a lack of clarity still. So that's one big takeaway that I had. The second is that I think it's just sort of been this, like, kind of in the back of my mind for a long time now. I feel like teams are not fully realizing the benefits of a systematic design practice. Honestly, we hear this or echoes of this in our survey every year. There's always folks who are saying, I'm just frustrated with the results that I'm getting from my system. It's not doing the things I thought it would do. I'm having a hard time keeping the promises that I made. And so I'm hoping today to take you on the journey that I've been on for all of this year, basically. And it's kind of been driven by these 2 takeaways. One, that there's just still a lot of confusion about this stuff. And 2, we're not getting the benefits out of the systems we're building. So I went down this path of research and interviews and just sort of like processing all this to try and figure out, how do we address these 2 takeaways? And the result of that was what we're now calling the anatomy of a design system. The way that our team has kind of arrived at this is just by stepping back, from the day-to-day work and looking at a lot of design systems, talking to a lot of people who build them. And that's really kind of how we landed here. And one of the things I think that I realized in going out and just reading all the articles I could find that defined design systems, and believe me, there are a lot, one of the things that I felt was missing from most of them is just this idea that, like, we're trying to define them without offering context. And I think that's actually, the context is actually really important. And I want to talk just for a moment about why that is. And pretty much every organization out there is trying desperately to connect their brand to some audience, right? That's kind of just like at a very high level what we're trying to do. And they do that in a lot of ways, right? Sometimes they print a bunch of stuff and it shows up in your mail. Sometimes they're designing these very, nuanced in-store experiences. Sometimes they're just advertising on podcasts and TV and all the other places. And pretty much every organization has this major touch point of digital experiences. These are things like websites and native applications. It's the stuff that you and I do in our daily work. Well, design systems sit right in between the brand and the digital experiences that we design, build, and deploy in order to connect with that desired audience. I think this context is really important because it helps us when you look at it like this, it helps us to understand that there are inputs and outputs of a really effective design system. And with this context, I think we can understand that the system has to sit inside of a bigger picture, right? So let's talk about all of this in terms of what makes up a design system. Now, what I hope to talk through today is, I feel like it's a pretty comprehensive breakdown of design systems. And as an industry, we've been doing this work for a long time now. It's been years and years that we've been doing this stuff. And so at least for us at Sparkbox, this is kind of our attempt to put a stake in the ground internally for us and just to say, hey, when we use these words, these are the things that we mean. I'm hoping that maybe sharing what, kind of where we're landing will also help you all have those conversations internally. So we're going to start with the layers. The layers are labeled on the bottom: foundations, tokens, core systems, and components. And these are very conceptual. And then we're going to kind of make them more tangible by looking at what makes up those layers. And that's these parts: assets, processes, and documentation. So we're going to dive into that sort of conceptual portion here, and we're going to start with foundations. Foundations layer is really a subset of the organization's brand, and it's intended to be used in the design and development of digital interfaces. So you could think about color or type here, right? So an organization might have a primary brand color, but they also are going to offer guidance in their brand guidelines around how to use lots of other colors, in relation to that sort of one core brand color, or maybe one or two colors. Well, in the world of digital interfaces, the stuff that we're doing every day, we're usually trying to help a user accomplish a task of some kind. And so for us, we might need like a set of neutral palette. We might need just, a few colors that are designed to sort of convey a role or like a state. But all those colors that might be used in a lot of other contexts outside of the digital space or like digital interface space might not be relevant to what we do. And so what we're doing is we're taking all that brand color information and we're filtering it down into what's needed for digital interface work. Same might be true of type. You may have a bunch of interfaces, a bunch of typefaces that are they're great for things like print or even like a billboard or a truck wrapper or something, but some of those are not going to work well in the context of digital. So what type do we need? What fonts do we need for screens? So other than color, color and type, there's lots of things that could live at this foundations layer. You've got design principles, guidelines around iconography, illustration, sound, some information around voice and tone, and your logos, your typefaces, photography, motion, layout, elevation, all of this kind of stuff, right? And the best design systems, they take all of these things from the brand at the brand level that applies to the entire organization, and they focus those things down. They clarify those things in terms of what's needed specifically for digital interface work. Okay, so that's the foundations layer. So let's move outward from that layer, and we'll add in the tokens layer. The tokens layer is a set of codified design decisions, and usually these are based on the decisions, the things that we've articulated in that foundations layer. The goal here is to take those concepts that we expressed in the foundations layer and codify them. And then when I say codify, all I really mean is that those design concepts are given a name and a value, okay? So if we use color as an example, you might define a color token that has a name, something like color primary brand, and assign that token the value of your primary blue in this case, okay? And it's not just colors that this could work with, right? You could decide you want all the border radius of your buttons to be 4 pixels and create a token for that. You could think about margin and padding, and those can all be lots and lots of options for what can be tokenized. So when you break it down, there's kind of like 3 main reasons to use design tokens. The first is consistent design. So because you have that single source of truth for, in that example case, the hex value of your primary brand color, you can trust that it's going to be used consistently, right? Like that use case of using that token instead of pasting in a hex value somewhere or going and using an eyedropper tool and trying to get as close as you can to that color. So you get consistency by using tokens. The second main reason to use this is ease of change. So when at some point in the future you do decide to rebrand and modify your colors in some way, you can change it in that one place, right? Wherever you're managing that token, and you can trust that that change, that color change, will ripple through the interfaces in a healthy way. And anything that's built using the system, using that token, will also see that change. So you get a real easy way to kind of make changes across platforms, across products. And then the third reason is really this idea of multi-platform support. So when you do this work of defining your tokens, you're doing that in a system that's separate from everything else. And then you can take that token, that set of token definitions, and you can translate them or transform them into pretty much any format that you need. So in this way, you can support web interfaces that might be built with Sass or CSS, or you could find a way to also support color or some of these other design decisions in a native application that's built in iOS. The same tokens translated into files that can be used for each of those developer platforms or frameworks. Okay, so we mentioned color, we talked a little bit about border radius, some other things, but there's a lot of things that you can tokenize. I'll just give you a few lists here, right? So type, you could even do entire font stacks as tokens, so letter spacing, line height, font weight. We talked a bit about color, but you can be more specific. You can do background, foreground colors. You can use tokens to do theming, to do light mode, dark mode, spacing decisions around padding or margin, elevation, opacity. You get the idea here. Lots of things can be tokenized, and it's a long list. And really, the ones that you choose to implement are kind of going to be determined by what's really important to your organization. So we've got foundations that are built from the brand. Out from that, we have tokens. And then the third layer we call core systems. And this is a set of building block systems that are used to solve common interface challenges. The best way I have to sort of explain this is that if you codify a single design decision, you're going to get a token. But when you codify how those design decisions work together, that's a core system. So you could codify a single decision like a spacing token, and then using that spacing token, you could codify how to handle layout, maybe in a grid system. And there's a lot of common interface challenges you can come up with great solutions for. So things like iconography or layout and grids, theming systems, color systems, type scale, animation, all of these kinds of things. And there's many more. Again, these are not exhaustive lists. Most of the time, these core systems are going to be built with tokens, and that enables that ease of change that we talked about earlier. Now, these inner three layers, we call the fundamental layers. That's kind of because these are what everything else is going to be based on. And if you're someone whose job it is to kind of build or maintain a design system, then a lot of what you're going to be doing is creating stability at these fundamental layers. And that's going to create stability in the outer layers, okay? Now let's talk about the next layer out, the fourth layer, which is components. And the components layer contains the reusable parts of a digital interface. This is what most people think of when they talk about design systems, right? It's the stuff you can see when you look at a website or an app. It's form inputs and labels and, that little thing where you got text next to a picture and, the results listing in your search page, just all that kind of stuff, right? Components can be very simple, like they can be as simple as like a button or a text input. They can also be very complex, like a header or a navigation. Usually you're going to take simple components and you're going to nest those in order to create more complex ones. And when they're built properly, they are constructed from the foundations, the tokens, and the core systems. Now, your subscribers are likely going to focus mostly on the components layer, right? They're kind of approaching this from the outside. But having these fundamental layers beneath gives those components greater depth, much better reasoning, and a lot more flexibility. Now, of course, the list of possible components is really long. So I'll just give you a few to kind of get us thinking in the same direction. Things like notifications and buttons and search bars and breadcrumb navigations and tabs and tooltips and radio. You get the idea. It literally would be impossible for me to list them all here, but I hope that you can see how this approach, right, starting with the brand and then adding these layers until we reach the components layer, is going to give you a really solid and extendable design system. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot at you quickly here, but in order to really kind of cover the complexity of design systems, we have to break this down a little bit further. So the way we'll do that is just simply by looking at 3 different parts that each of these layers is made up of. And those parts are assets, processes, and documentation. If we drill in just to think about assets, these are the tangible things that make each layer usable. So let's take a peek at the layers and give an example of an asset for each of them. So an example asset for the foundations layer might be a collection of logo files that are intended for use on the web. So these are assets because they're really tangible, right? This is literally an actual image file. It's something you can use very tangibly in some way to construct an interface. At the tokens layer, an example might be that we have a set of color tokens that have been transformed into CSS variables for use in a website or a web application. You can kind of see that the tokens have been transformed here into CSS variables, and these can be used then, imported directly into a project and used by someone who's writing CSS. So very tangible, right? This is an actual file. That's why it's an asset. And it's something a product designer can import directly into their work. These are just examples. There's lots and lots of assets at each layer. Okay. At that third layer, the core systems layer, you might have a layout system that's been built with Sass. In this case, you've got like a Sass file that contains some mix-ins that are intended to be used in handling layout in some way. And so, you might have a mix-in that makes a row. And this is obviously very, very simple. The important point here is not the code, but it's that these things are tangible, right? This is something I can actually use in my work. And then it's not always code, right? So at the fourth layer, we could have things like coded components. We could also have a button that's been, a designed button in Figma that a designer can use in their prototyping or in their design for a product. So remember that the important point here is that assets are the tangible things, right, that your design system offers. But there is a lot more than just these very tangible things for each of the layers. So let's talk a little bit about processes. Processes define the human behaviors as we work on and with a design system. And these tend to fall into a few categories. Communication is kind of the one that always comes to my mind first, right? Because design system work requires us to bring together lots of disciplines. We have to have some process in place for when and how we communicate with each other. This is going to include things like giving and receiving feedback as well. So accepting ideas for the system from your subscribers, accepting bug reports from your subscribers. And it also, involves whatever communication you have in place to communicate with those folks who are willing to engage in that way while you're incorporating their ideas. You're also going to need governance and contribution process, right? This is going to include how we go about prioritizing work, right? Governance meaning what do we allow in to the system and what do we determine needs to remain outside of the system. And contribution meaning when we've got folks in the organization that are willing to help you in some more tangible way, like giving them a set of expectations for what that contribution is going to look like. If you want them to contribute more than one time, you probably need to have a pretty good process in place for that. Another common sort of set of processes are synchronization and testing. So if you're going to support multiple disciplines, multiple platforms, perhaps multiple brands, with the assets that you offer, you're going to have to define some process for keeping all of those things in sync. Now, there's some automation, obviously, that you can use to do that, but there's also going to be some manual work involved in that sync. And then testing, because the power of a system is that rapid change and rapid distribution of design decisions and scaling, your design. You also have to have some process in place to make sure that is being used in a way that's healthy. So testing is key here. Another area for process is deprecation, right? So what happens when you remove something from the system or when you stop supporting it? Not having a process around deprecation is one of the fastest ways to frustrate your subscribers. I would recommend that you think this through a little bit before you decide to deprecate. And in fact, just having a process defined is a really good way to build trust, right? When folks feel like they're going to be taken care of in the future as things change, because they always do, that's a great way to show them that you actually are thinking about this long term. As your adoption grows, you're going to have to start thinking through, what's the process we go through to release a new version, right? This becomes really important. And at some point, you may want to define some process around how to extend the system, right? If you've got specific products that have deeper needs than you feel should be supported at the design system level, how do you enable those teams to take the system and extend it in a way that they need it, that they need it to be done? It's best to be the kind of system that's not saying no to everything, right? You don't want to be a system that's always saying no. You want to be a system that says something more along the lines of, let's figure out how to support you in that, And the last sort of category that I have here is just this idea of onboarding. And this is going to include, what is the process like for onboarding new subscribers? When somebody's interested in using the system in their product, how do you help them come up to speed? But also some ideas around how the design system team can actually be involved in onboarding new employees, right, for the product teams. And you can be involved in that and then send those folks out to the product teams as advocates for using the system, which can be a really strong approach for this. So let's take a look at some more specific examples. At the foundations layer, you will likely have a set of expectations for communication between the brand team and the design systems team. Remember that brand team is the part of the organization that's thinking about the company as a whole, right? What are the things that we need for the brand as a whole? And the design system team has taken that and focused it down into something that's hyper relevant for digital interface work. So these things are going to have impact on each other. At some point, when there are changes in the brand, there has to be a process for how that gets communicated down to the design system team, implemented out through all of these layers. And sometimes you may learn that, hey, the brand that we have established actually is not going to serve us well long term unless we make some changes. And there's the potential for that to kind of work its way back out to the brand team as well. At the core systems layer, at the tokens layer, you may have a process for modifying the value of a token, right? This is really important to think about. For all the power you get by having tokens, you also have the ability for a small change to ripple out through all of those interfaces. So it can be kind of risky. And you've got to have some process in place to make sure you're doing that responsibly. At the core systems layer, you might have a process in place for deprecating an old core system. So perhaps, maybe CSS evolves a little bit and you have some new feature and it allows you to handle layout in a more nuanced way. Well, you want your system to be able to kind of move, flexibly as the technology evolves. So you need a process to be able to deprecate that old one once you've got a new layout system in place. And at the components layer, you might define a process for accepting component modifications from your subscribers. I guarantee you these components are not going to be perfect at the beginning, right? So once they're out in the real world, your subscribers are going to find problems. And if they're willing to engage with you in a way that is like, we actually have ideas, we want to make changes and give them back to you, then you probably are going to have to find a process to define here around how that collaboration and contribution happens. Of course, these are just a few examples. There are lots and lots of processes that are involved here. And you're probably not going to start with all of these defined out of the gate, but it's really good practice to do the work to capture this stuff as you have need for it and your system is maturing. Okay, and finally, we have this idea of documentation, which explains why something is the way it is and offers a breakdown of when and how to use it. So again, we'll walk through each layer here. At the foundations layer, you might document your point of view on color. And I've just pulled a few examples here from IBM's Carbon design system. So here's an example of some documentation on their doc site that's laying out sort of the foundational color information that you need to know. So this is great documentation. It's explaining sort of the palette of blues, the colors they use for alerts, and it's telling you how they handle, you know, layering colors and using colors together. At the tokens layer, you might have a explanation of how to name tokens, right? This, I mean, notoriously, it's difficult, right, to come up with good names for tokens. It's just a difficult thing to do. And so here's an example, again, of some documentation in the Carbon design system where they have said, hey, here's how we name tokens, right? We break the names down in these ways. Here's how you can look at a token name and understand the meaning of this specific token. At the core systems layer, you might want to provide some documentation on how to use a theming system that you have in place, right? So again, here's an example from Carbon where it talks about how we apply themes. How do we use the theming system, so the core system layer, how do we use that system that enables us to, in this case, support like a light mode and a dark mode? And then at that components layer, you know, you're gonna want to break down all the different pieces and parts of a component. And the example that I have for you is breaking those pieces and parts of a button down. Here's an example of that, again, from the Carbon design system, where they literally are sort of identifying a taxonomy. What do we call these things? The background, the border, the icon that's used here, the text, and giving themselves sort of like an explanation for everybody on the team to have that common shared language. Of course, there's a lot of other things that you'll have to document. Thought it would be helpful just to see a few, and luckily, Casey's presentation, which will happen here shortly, is going to walk through a bunch more of these ideas and kind of show them to you in the real world. Now, there are also some assets, processes, and documentation that live at the system level, right? As opposed to at these like fundamental inner three or the components layers. So I'll just mention those briefly. So at the system level, the assets, the primary asset that you're going to have is the doc site itself, right? This is kind of the repository for everything we just have discussed so far. And remember, if your doc site is confusing, that's a big deal, right? It's going to reflect poorly on the system itself. In particular, findability is really key for doc sites. And that's because if a subscriber comes to the site and just doesn't see the thing they think they need, they're going to find a way to get that done. And that means they're probably going to build something that's already been built, you know? So making sure your doc site has great search or really good sort of intuitive navigation is really critical. And having a site that just looks and feels professional is going to just build confidence, you know, in those subscribers. At the process, at the system level for processes, you know, these are kind of focused on contribution, right? It's a lot more than just contributing a component. You could be, you know, writing documentation. You could be explaining onboarding. There's lots of things that you could be documenting here, but a lot of communication processes here. Really, we're setting the expectation for how we'll behave, you know, with the system level processes, and trying to make sure that folks understand what the expectations are for how they use the thing. Documentation at the system level is kind of focused on making those different subscriber groups feel like they're in the right place. You know, you want all the disciplines to feel like they belong there. So you may have, you know, something along the lines of like how to get started as a designer, or how to include these files in your React project. You know, stuff that lets them know this is intended for me. And over time, there's going to be a lot of documentation that's needed as well to kind of explain how all of these things work together. You know, what are the best practices for using your system? How should buttons maybe live on a page together? Or how do we handle empty states? You know, these are kind of guidelines, but they're also best practices. Some folks call these patterns, right? They are really documentation for the system at this level. So I'll just take us back to the very beginning here. And if you remember that we did these 2 consulting engagements and we had these 2 big takeaways, the first of which is that there is still a lot of confusion about design systems out there. Well, that journey that I've been on has been to try and alleviate some of that confusion. So when you take this model all together, I hope that it can provide some clarity around the pieces, the parts that make up a system. But really what I want is for all of you to go back to your organizations and at least to see the importance of the exercise of defining these things. I want it to spur conversation. I want it to give you something to think about and to talk about inside your organization with your team. I know at least here at Sparkbox that we're going to be doubling down on the education we do as part of our consulting. I just don't think any of us should be making assumptions that the folks we work with share the same understanding of these things. So it's better to be clear, right? So that was that first takeaway. And the second was this idea that teams are not realizing the full benefits of a systematic design practice. And when we talk about the benefits of design systems, there's always these 2 that kind of rise to the surface: consistency and efficiency. So let's talk just briefly about each of these. The layers, the foundations, tokens, core systems, and components are kind of what give us the potential for consistency, right? So simply having a set of components to use, right, component assets, that's going to allow individuals in your organization to say something like, the buttons in my product all look the same. So this is a level of consistency, but it's sort of like at the individual level, right? And then having foundations, tokens, and core systems will actually allow a department to say, all the digital products we offer look and feel the same. So this is a much broader statement, right? This is across the department, all of us saying, hey, the products we offer, there's consistency across the products, not just a single button in a single product, right? And I think these are the things that a lot of times we think about when we talk about consistency, and these are admirable things to aspire to. But I think there's a deeper level of consistency that we should be reaching for. And that really can only happen when our design systems are rooted in that established brand. And in that case, the culture of the company is that every interaction a customer has with us aligns with our brand. Now, this is kind of a big statement, right? It requires us to connect the work that we do on digital interfaces to the bigger mission of the companies where we work. It's different than consistency at the individual or department level because it speaks to interactions with your company's audience that are way beyond just the digital work. And that's kind of why it's so cultural, right? It's a recognition that you are all on the same team. The product folks, the marketing people, IT, customer service, logistics, even sales, right? And this is a healthy perspective for us to have inside of an organization. And I'm not saying that having a design system gives you all of that automatically, but design systems that start with the brand and build out from there are at least going to give you a shot at achieving this level of cultural consistency. Now, the second benefit we talked about was efficiency. And I think it's really the parts of each layer that offer us the ability to kind of achieve some efficiency in the work we do. So the assets we offer enable, like an individual could say something like, I can design or build a feature faster, a workflow, a page, whatever, however you break your work down. I can do that work as an individual. I can do it faster because I've got I've got components to use. I've got reusable pieces and parts, right? And then there's sort of like the same kind of idea here with like a departmental level, right? And we achieve that with a process, defining our processes, right? These allow us to work more efficiently with each other, and for our departments to say that we get to market faster. I've heard this from leadership across lots of organizations. This is one of their main goals. We want to be able to move quicker, And I think most of the time when we talk about efficiency, we're thinking about these kinds of things. How can I do my job faster? Give me some components to build with, right? How can we work a little bit better together? Let's define some processes. But I think that there's another level here. And I think documentation is kind of where, if we do the work to really define the language that we use to talk about the problems we're solving, there's like another level of efficiency we can achieve. And it's when you have all three of these working together, your company will have a shot at reaching this cultural level of impact. And it sounds kind of understated, but the phrase is just simple, like that we understand each other. I mean, think about this. Have you ever been in a meeting where you're talking about some future work or some feature that you're supposed to be working on, and you leave that meeting feeling great? You walk out and you think, I know exactly what to do. You sit down, you get to work, and then a day later, maybe a week later, maybe a month later, everybody's getting back together again to kind of review progress, and you realize, oh my gosh, we misunderstood each other. We've been working on different things. That kind of miscommunication happens way more than we would like to admit. It's widespread, and it creates some of the most damaging inefficiencies in your culture. It's going to create real frustration for your employees. And honestly, it's going to create animosity between the departments. At the root of that is that we haven't taken the time to actually document the language that we use to have these conversations. And again, design systems are not going to guarantee you reach this level of efficiency, but when they're built right, I think they actually give you a shot at better understanding each other. And that's where real efficiency actually comes from. So in addition to providing a little clarity about what systems are, the pieces and the parts, I hope this model is kind of giving you a little bit more clarity around why it's important that we do this work. And honestly, what I would love is to hear that it helps you achieve more meaningful efficiency and more authentic consistency in your design system work.